Welcome to Injustigate. My name is Justin Sullivan, and I'm a journalist based out of Buffalo, New York, who's covered everything from murder trials to chicken laws. And yes, you heard that last part right. I started this channel to tell stories that I feel like have just been waiting to be told. Stories that I feel like need to be revisited, and stories on things most people wouldn't even realize they were curious about. So please like and subscribe to this video so you never miss out. And without further ado, let the investigation begin. It was once considered the model community for West New York's blue-collar middle class. However, these days, the community of Love Canal is most well known as being one of the most appalling environmental tragedies in American history and the start of the environmental justice movement. But perhaps the worst part, as you'll hear, these events were far from isolated. The houses in Love Canal were government subsidized. Many former residents on fixed incomes were attracted to the community's proximity to the Niagara River and the mortgages that were just under $200 a month, but included a full house and around an acre of land. However, that also came with a price, as residents were engulfed with the smell of chemicals and smoke. Despite Niagara Falls housing one of the 7 wonders of the world, it was also known as home to some of the country's 10 major chemical companies, which made up an area called Chemical Row. And it only took one visit to Niagara Falls, which was and still remains a popular tourist attraction, to notice the pollution. Residents remember it almost being the norm to experience health issues, specifically breathing problems. Trees and gardens were turning black and dying, and the community was filled with puddles of hazardous waste. Many residents recall not being able to keep pets alive because they would become sick and die. And miscarriages, stillbirths, and children being born with birth defects became frighteningly common. At that time, the EPA was only a few years old, and the world had never heard of the word Superfund site, much less know the long-term impact of toxic waste, especially from corporations that produce common household items such as clothing and pet food. It was a group of residents who called themselves the Moms of Love Canal who spoke out about the community. The group was led by Lois Gibbs, a single mom of 2 children whose son began experiencing seizures once he entered kindergarten at the 99th Street School, which was located in the community. Not only did elected officials not believe residents who spoke out, they didn't want to. The smell of chemicals was unfortunately, in their words, the smell of a good economy. Love Canal was founded by a railroad lawyer named William T. Love in 1890 in an attempt to create a utopian model city. While little is known about Love or his true intentions for purchasing the land, he planned on building an artificial waterfall in the Niagara Gorge and a canal that would connect the upper and lower Niagara River. Water flowing into the river from the waterfall would generate hydroelectricity via a power plant. The plan would fail shortly after. Love would reportedly go on to join the Alaska Gold Rush, and engineer Nikola Tesla would go on to successfully generate hydroelectricity and have the Tesla car named after him. As for the canal, in the 1940s, the U.S. government briefly used it for a TNT factory and then for radioactive storage from the Manhattan Project. Hooker Chemical Corporation, one of the several companies that made up Niagara Falls' Chemical Row, purchased the land and began filling it with chemicals. The Hooker Chemical Corporation would eventually sell the land to the Niagara Falls School District for $1, with a limited liability clause included in the sale. Upon its closure, the canal was covered with a clay seal to prevent leakage. Over time, vegetation settled and began to grow on top the dump site. The school board built a playground and an elementary school on the site and sold the remaining land to developers who were building houses to accommodate Niagara Falls' growing population at the time. Construction activities at the site breached the containment structures, which resulted in the chemicals draining into the community. Additionally, the melting of 60 inches of snow, left from the 3-day blizzard of 1977, which plagued Western New York, caused the water tables in the Love Canal area to rise and push the toxic chemicals up to the Earth's surface. Despite limited education, funds, and resources, Lois and her neighbors educated themselves, developed strategies, and assessed the impact of toxic wastes on their health. One way they succeeded in challenging corporate and government policies on dumping hazardous materials was that they managed to remain in the news and keep Love Canal on the top of people's minds. President Jimmy Carter ultimately declared a state of emergency in 1978 and had the federal government relocate 239 families within the centermost part of the canal. Pregnant women and infants were deliberately among the first to be taken out. However, this left 700 families who federal officials viewed as being at insufficient risk to warrant relocation. And despite the government recognizing that the community was dangerous and there being no real proof that the chemicals were only impacting those directly above the canal, the only thing separating the residents was a chain-link fence. Plus, the more than 200 residents that were relocated were only allowed to relocate until their youngest child was at least 2 or their pregnancy was terminated. That month, out of one of the former evacuated homes, the Love Canal Homeowners Association was established to give the community a voice in the decisions made during the Love Canal environmental crisis. Within a week of the health order, the residents held a public meeting, elected officers, and set goals for the newly formed organization that would represent the remaining families. Members of the Homeowners Association would go on to say that the more they learned, the more frightened they became, if that was even possible. But that just fueled their fight. It became life or death. They protested alongside the cleanup efforts, symbolically burned dolls in the street, and even posed for almost disturbing, artistic-like photos that really captured the distress these residents were experiencing. But it didn't end there. The residents, which were still mostly families with small children, were relocated to local hotels. As I mentioned earlier, Niagara Falls was a tourist destination, and these residents were taking up touristed spots. The residents also became ostracized in the community. In the PBS American Experience documentary Poisoned Ground, The Tragedy at Love Canal, produced by filmmaker Jamila Efron, one resident even recalled being asked if she was from Love Canal or normal. Community members were quoted saying that they felt like refugees in their own city. It all came to a head when residents held 2 EPA agents hostage, safely, let me state, during a visit to the canal. The residents barricaded the doors and gave the government an ultimatum: paid relocation or else. After another hard battle, activists forced Carter to declare a second state of emergency in 1981, during which the remaining families were relocated 26 months after the initial evacuation. On that day, President Carter approved emergency financial aid for the Love Canal area, the first emergency funds to ever be approved for something other than a natural disaster. And the U.S. Senate also approved a sense of Congress amendment saying that the federal aid should be forthcoming to relieve the serious environmental disaster which had occurred. State figures show that more than 200 purchase offers for homes were made, totaling nearly $7 million. But looking into Love Canal, I also learned that there was a smaller community of rental apartments located above the canal called Griffin Manor. The low-income housing project consisted of about 250 rentals and was located on the downtown Niagara Falls side of Love Canal. Similar to the Love Canal neighborhood, the area was once utilized after the war. In Griffin Manor's case, to house employees of Bell Aircraft before being sold to the city of Niagara Falls to become public housing. Even though Griffin Manor was also considered part of the third ring of residents, who were on the outer part of the community and not part of the first group to receive relocation, their concerns predated the residents of Love Canal. However, their faces were rarely in the news. The residents of Griffin Manor were Black renters and had to organize their own fight. So they became the Love Canal Renters Association. However, many people were less sympathetic to the Griffin Manor residents because they didn't actually own their properties like the residents in Love Canal did. Love Canal is often considered the start of the environmental justice movement, and I think in Griffin Manor's case, it really proves how environmental justice is actually the movement's response to environmental racism. Environmental equity is not environmental justice. Environmental equity is actually the government's response to the needs of the people. After the evacuation, the Environmental Protection Agency found that Love Canal was not an isolated incident. The EPA found that there were actually nearly 800 other Love Canals across the country. In response to the crisis, the federal government passed the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act of 1980. This legislation established the Superfund program to investigate and clean up sites contaminated with hazardous substances. One of the biggest debates over the establishment of the Superfund site was who was going to pay for it. Ultimately, Congress decided that the program will follow a polluters pay principle, which would mandate that the responsible party pay for any damages done to the natural environment. In Love Canal's case, Hooker Chemical ended up paying hundreds of millions of dollars at the time, reimbursing the federal and state government, as well as settling a lawsuit with the more than 1,300 residents of Love Canal. Since the responsible party is sometimes impossible to find, the program was also funded by an excess tax on petroleum and chemical manufacturers. That tax would stop in the mid-1990s, and the Superfund program would go on to be funded primarily by taxpayers. For years after that, the excess chemical tax ended. The yearly cleanup rate dropped, even going as little as 8 cleanups in 2014 out of 1,200 Superfund sites at the time. However, in 2021, Congress passed the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which resumed the excess tax on chemical manufacturers through July 2032. That being said, the Love Canal evacuated site wasn't declared safe by the Environmental Protection Agency and officially removed from the list of Superfund waste sites until 2004. There are currently a little more than 1,300 Superfund sites in the United States. These don't even represent all the toxic waste dumps housed throughout the country. But what about the communities that will never see remediation or never be recognized as severe enough to make it on the priority list? The communities that don't have the resources to organize or lowest gives to lead. The communities of people that are trapped, living in a home with no value, or, in the worst case scenario, trying to survive in a certified ghost town. Approximately 21 million people, so around 6% of the population, live within a mile of a Superfund site, potentially exposing them to harmful chemicals and toxins such as lead, arsenic, and mercury. And just because toxic land does not qualify for the Superfund priority list does not mean that an area is not polluted. Currently, the town of East Palestine, Ohio is trying to save itself from becoming the next American tragedy after a freight train carrying hazardous materials derailed in 2023, an issue that was worsened following the burning of 5 tank cars of vinyl chloride, which the government said they do to prevent an explosion. A study found that the train derailment polluted 16 states, with people near the accident reporting headaches, nausea, and rashes. While the area is still not considered a Superfund site, Norfolk Southern agreed to pay $600 million to the people who live within 20 miles of the derailment under the agreement that they are not responsible for the pollution. Unfortunately, there are more of these sites than there are remediations, and closing that gap is hard if you're already running on borrowed time. Like many things, these polluted cities are reminders of what happens when the government doesn't listen to the people that they serve, who would have never guessed that something like this would have happened to them. I think this is an example of how injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, especially when it becomes airborne. Thank you to everyone who tuned in and listened to my first episode. You have no idea how much I appreciate it. Again, please like, subscribe, and comment below. I would really love to hear what you have to say. And please stay tuned and subscribe. I promise there is more to come, and I will only get better from here. Thank you again. Take care and stay curious.